Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so have you ever seen an organization talk a massive game but then completely fail to actually do anything in practice? Today, we're diving straight into the historical records of post-1945 Austrian student fraternities, known as the Burschenschaften, to uncover a really fascinating contradiction. We are looking directly at their own internal documents, historical surveys, and chronicles to understand exactly how a highly ideological group became completely paralyzed by its own traditions. Let's dive right in and see what the sources reveal.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll examine their self-proclaimed role as a value elite. Second, the internal debate of education versus action. Third, the massive discrepancy with reality. Fourth, the actual causes of this passivity, and finally, their historical waves of politicization.
Starting off with Section 1, Die politische Werteelite, the political value elite.
To really understand this group, we first have to understand how they viewed themselves. In the post-1945 era, the Austrian Burschenschaften seriously considered themselves the absolute most political of all fraternity types. This 1974 quote from Waldemar Steiner, a fraternity member and politician, perfectly captures their grand self-image. He said, "Without political will, a Burschenschaft wouldn't be a Burschenschaft." They didn't just see themselves as some social club. No way. They viewed themselves as a group uniquely destined to shape political events, and they expected a lifelong commitment from their members.
The texts reveal that this ideology rests on a very specific concept, being a Wert elite, literally a value elite. They believed this status gave them a natural claim to political leadership roles, and this claim was built on an ethos of personal sacrifice, along with deeply rooted pan-Germanic political ideals. According to their documents, their political mandate included protecting what they saw as the German character of Austria and actively opposing what they viewed as communist, materialist, and foreign influences.
Now, as you might guess, the source documents revealed that this aggressive, uncompromising political agenda repeatedly caused internal friction. It really alienated them from other, maybe more politically tolerant or simply passive fraternities, like the Corps, who often used the Burschenschaften's intense political demands as a reason to just keep their distance.
Moving on to Section 2, Bildung or Aktion, education or action.
So if they had this grand political mandate, how exactly were these students supposed to execute it? Well, it wasn't a settled debate at all. Historically, they were split right down the middle into two streams. On one side, you had the Armenistichu approach, which focused purely on cultivating the mind through political and moral education, and on the other side, the Germanische stream, which demanded direct, boots-on-the-ground political intervention and action from its members.
The Austrian fraternities generally aligned with the activist, interventionist camp in theory. They even passed resolutions demanding direct political action. But the texts surprisingly show that their actual internal focus was often restricted to mere educational activities. They talked a huge game about action, but their promotional materials and internal records from the time really just point to things like distributing flyers or hosting lectures.
Which brings us right to Section 3, Diskrepanz zur Realität, the discrepancy with reality.
Let me give you a perfect example of this staggering gap between their theoretical ambition and their daily practice. In 1957, their umbrella organization passed this grand declarative resolution promising to send an official delegation of 15 to 20 Austrian Burschenschafter to the Marinara Hochschulwochen. This was a highly important political event regarding the South Tyrol crisis. But the historical record shows that when the time actually came, exactly 3 people showed up. Just 3!
The true depth of this discrepancy is really driven home by some incredible survey data from 1963. When asked how they spent their time over 2 semesters, the fraternities reported a massive 5,250 hours dedicated to fencing, the traditional mensur. Add to that 1,064 hours spent on official drinking and socializing events. And political education, a meager 510 hours. Think about that for a second. They were spending 10 times more hours crossing swords than they were discussing politics.
And this internal contradiction absolutely did not go unnoticed. By 1991, we see intense, disillusioned frustration voiced by members themselves, like Günter Pendel. He complained, "Sometimes one even has the impression that we have relapsed into the drinking and fighting clubs of the pre-Burschenschafts era." They realized they were entirely neglecting their grand political mission in favor of partying and dueling, and it was causing genuine anger from within.
So, why did this happen? Let's look at Section 4, Ursachen der Passivität, the causes of passivity.
Why was this highly ideological group virtually paralyzed in practice? Well, the texts identify 4 main structural hurdles. First, their mission to ideologically influence the German fraternities. Second, those incredibly time-consuming traditions. Third, a massive institutional bureaucracy. And fourth, a deep programmatic vacuum following the year 1945.
Let's break down the logistics here. We already saw how daily fencing consumed thousands of hours. But combine that with a massive, self-created institutional bureaucracy. They had local rings, national convents, German-Austrian umbrella groups, formal bilateral friendships. Maintaining this complex web required endless delegate meetings, honor courts, and formal visits. Because student memberships were already pretty small, simply keeping the lights on in this bureaucratic maze left literally no time or energy for actual outward political action.
And then there's the fourth cause, the programmatic vacuum. Imagine your organization's entire ideological foundation just vanishing overnight. After 1945, the collapse of the Third Reich utterly destroyed their core political goals. They found themselves ideologically disoriented in the new Austrian Republic. Their old pan-German goals had to be legally reframed to comply with new laws. Without a practical modern political program, they were effectively paralyzed. They fell back into empty traditionalism simply because they didn't know how to move forward.
Finally, we reach Section 5, Wellen der Politisierung, waves of politicization.
Despite all these massive structural hurdles, there were specific historical moments when they actually did manage to mobilize. Tracing the chronological waves from the source text, we see the 1950s were simply about restoration and survival. But around 1960, the South Tyrol crisis temporarily shocked them out of their passivity. Then, in the late 1960s and 70s, the rise of the student left gave them an ideological enemy, sparking an anti-Marxist reaction. Finally, in the 1980s and 90s, they found a new political vessel by closely aligning with the FPO political party.
The text notes that these external crises, particularly the anti-communist mobilization against the student left, gave them a temporary sense of mission. They held seminars and published flyers to combat what they saw as a looming Marxist threat on campuses. However, the internal documents critically note that this often manifested as unreflective verbal radicalism, basically just loud, provocative talk rather than an effective, sustained political strategy. They were vocal, sure, but strategically hollow.
Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought to consider today, summarizing the ultimate paradox of the Austrian Burschenschaften, based on the historical evidence. Does rigid adherence to tradition and an inward-facing bureaucracy ensure a movement's survival, or does it ultimately guarantee its political irrelevance? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the historical sources. I hope this explainer has provided you with a structured, impartial, and clear understanding of this fascinating sociological contradiction. Keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.